Hi, and welcome back to another one of our online lectures here in world history. Today we're going to look at the Reformation. And we lumped the Reformation and the Renaissance together because there's a lot of similarities both in time period and in themes. The Renaissance was rebirth, and in a way, it's going to give a rebirth to education and thinking, which is really why the Reformation occurs at all. And we're going to talk a lot about that with a guy named Martin Luther. So the outcome here is Martin Luther and the Reformation. If we look at our constructive response question, it says, identify the reasons that drove Martin Luther to write the 95 Theses and describe the outcome of that action. We're going to talk about what the 95 Theses is. We're going to watch the film Luther, which will give us a really good insight into who Luther was and really what he did. And I think throughout watching that film and through this lecture, we're going to have a really, really good basis to answer this question. So we've got a lot of good things we're going to look at. So what will we learn about? We'll talk about the causes of the Reformation. We're going to look at the social, political, economic, and religious causes of the Reformation. And you see in the word Reformation, you see that word reform. Reform means change. And this is going to be some major change that comes in the church. And ultimately, spoiler alert, it's going to give us a split between Catholics and Protestants, which is one of the last outcomes of this unit. Certainly, we're going to talk about Martin Luther's story. Like I said, we're going to watch the film Luther, which will give us a lot of insight into who he was and what he did. We'll talk about his 95 Theses, and we will look at the response to Luther. And the response to Luther really, in a way, becomes the Reformation, which is a movement he never really thought he never intended to start, but because he was a very intelligent individual and wrote some things that resonated with a lot of people regarding church practices, the Reformation began and changed Christianity as we know it. So we've got a lot here that we need to look at, and it's going to be some very, very important things that will change Christianity forever. So let's set the stage here. By the 10th century, really by 900, maybe 1000 AD, we know that the Roman Catholic Church had dominated religious life in Northern and Western Europe. We have spent a lot of time talking about this in class. We know that the church was a constant variable. It was always there. It was always very powerful. Well, by the time you get closer to the Renaissance, more and more people are starting to get an education again, so you start seeing many people that began to criticize the church's practices. Now, I don't want you to think that everybody was doing this. The church certainly helped out millions of people and was very, very influential, but people started recognizing the church had some issues that needed addressing. One of the things that people were upset about is many people felt that the church leaders were too interested in worldly or secular pursuits, such as gaining wealth and political power. There's no doubt there were some clergy members who were really interested in the wrong things. Wealth and power would be two of the wrong things. The church is supposed to help people spiritually, not necessarily becoming a very wealthy institution. And there were many churches in the tail end of the Middle Ages up to the Renaissance that started having a lot of wealth. So that's going to bring us to the Reformation. And the Reformation, in its most simplest definition, is really a movement of religious reform. There's lots of different reasons people are going to be able to follow a guy like Martin Luther, as we're going to find out. But there's definitely some issues that need taking care of here. So let's look at the causes of the Reformation. Specifically, we'll start with the social causes. There's no doubt that Renaissance values led people to question the church. As the Renaissance grew and spread, people started having an education more so than they did during the Middle Ages, and people could start looking at things with a little bit more of a keen eye, and basically saying, hey, I don't have to accept the status quo. I don't have to accept the established authority. If I don't think it's working for me or for the people around me, we can try to evoke a change. So questioning your authority, questioning the church, was definitely something that came out of the Renaissance. Of course, it really only works if you have literature that you can use as a backup, as your proof. And of course, the printing press is really going to be instrumental in making that happen. So the printing press helps spread ideas critical of the church. And people tend to listen to people who make good decisions, people who make good points, and if that information is spreading very easily, then your cause is now going to have some volume to it. Political causes of the Reformation, there were some monarchs or kings that challenged the church as the supreme ruler or supreme power in Europe. And this has been a theme that's happened ever since our Charlemagne days. Obviously, if you're a king, you think you're a pretty big deal. And you go, why do I have to listen to the Pope? Why do I have to listen to the church? So there's some friction there in that age-old separation of church and state. But you have to also think about it as many of the popes were Italian, and they lived in Italy. They lived in Vatican City, which is in Italy, except for a short time when it moved, the home of the papacy moved to France. So a lot of people started saying, well, why is this Italian always having to tell us what to do? We've never met him. He doesn't come to our city. He doesn't come to our country. He doesn't even speak our language. So a lot of people started viewing the Pope as a foreign ruler. And we're wondering why they had to listen to the Pope if the Pope didn't truly represent them. So many leaders viewed the Pope as a foreign ruler and challenged his authority. Well, money's going to matter, economics. Many European princes and kings were jealous of the church's wealth. Again, not in all cases, but many different churches were certainly accumulating a lot more wealth than people were customary seeing from the church. A lot of people thought, hey, if I'm poor, why does the church have money instead of me? So what ended up happening is merchants and many other people resented having to pay taxes to a church that was already very wealthy. Religious causes of the Reformation. Some church leaders had become worldly or secular and corrupt. Corrupt is a word that can mean a lot of different things. Corruption can mean, killing people, doing terrible things, but it can also mean not following the vows or the rules that have been set down by canon law. For example, there were many different clergy members who had a very difficult time with the vow of celibacy. You're not supposed to have sex. You're not supposed to have children if you're a member of the clergy. And certainly there were those who violated that vow of celibacy. So that could make you corrupt, among other things. We'll talk about a couple of those on the next slide. But one of the biggest religious causes of the Reformation, this is really going to set off Martin Luther, is the idea of the indulgence. Many people found church practices such as indulgences as unacceptable. We've already talked about this because it was one of our vocab words, and we're certainly going to see it in the film Luther. But an indulgence was a common church practice where you paid the church to release a family member or yourself from purgatory. And you would get a piece of paper that suggested that and said that. So in a lot of ways, if you really want to simplify it, it was like buying your way into heaven or buying someone else's way into heaven. There's no scriptural support for this, and that's what's really going to make Martin Luther very angry. Now, the church was not trying to dupe people. They weren't trying to scheme people. They thought of it as a very important part of church practice, and they also used it to make a lot of money. But Martin Luther is going to find this to be a very shady practice, and that's going to be a big part of the reason why he writes the 95 Thesis, which starts the Reformation. Some other examples of causes of the Reformation or problems that existed connected to the church. Pope Alexander VI, he admitted that he had fathered several children, which of course again is not something he is supposed to be doing. He is not allowed to have sex. I mean, it's that simple. So that's corruption right there. Many priests and monks were poorly educated and couldn't teach people. Monasteries and convents are where people are supposed to be able to get an education, and if the monks there can't even read and write themselves, they're going to do a very lousy job of teaching others to read and write. So there was some problems with that as well. There are other clergy who married, there are some clergy who drank too much, others who gambled, and I'm overgeneralizing here. You have to understand this is not applying to all clergy. This is not saying all members of the church were bad at what they did, but there were certainly some people who were just really not following the rules, and that's going to set a lot of people off. That's going to make some people very angry about how the church is handling clergy. And then, of course, you have other problems connecting back to our Middle Ages unit, talking about simony, which is the selling of church positions, lay investiture, where kings and nobles appoint church officials, and, of course, that age-old division of church and state. So when we get to Martin Luther, there's definitely a whole slew of problems that need addressing within the church. Again, the Catholic Church is still helping a lot of people. It's still a very honorable institution, but just like anything else, the bigger it got, the more problems that came with it. So Martin Luther's definitely going to have a lot of different things that he's going to be able to use as he steps up and challenges the church. But indulgences are going to be one of the most pressing issues that he's going to have. So when we come back to part 2, we're going to talk a lot more about Martin Luther and what he did. So go ahead and hit stop here and cue up part 2.